How would you feel if your city had spent millions on a transit project that never saw any passengers? Today, we're looking at abandoned subway systems and stations all over the world in order to learn what these abandoned places can teach us about the future of transit.
Now, we have been building subway systems for almost 200 years. The Metropolitan Railway opened in 1863, and it started as wooden carriages being pulled by steam locomotives. And this is considered the world's very first underground passenger-carrying railway. This system was eventually absorbed into the London Underground, but it sparked the creation of subways across the globe. By the time the First World War started, electric underground railways had been built across the globe in Athens, Boston, Istanbul, New York City, Paris, Tokyo, and more. Unfortunately for some cities, things like politics, timing, or finances got in the way of their development. There are cities all over the world with empty stations, and some are frozen in time. Others have been completely swallowed by nature, and some were never even open to the public at all. If you know anything about abandoned subways, I'm sure you've heard of the world's largest abandoned subway in Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati's economy was absolutely booming by the mid-1800s. It was in the top 7 most populous US cities, and its pork and beer industries were huge. They had adopted electric streetcars by 1888, but the city was experiencing so much traffic, they needed something more if they were going to continue to grow. At this point, the Miami and Erie Canal ran right through the center of downtown Cincinnati, and what used to be a key piece of infrastructure for transporting goods off the Ohio River had become a polluted sewer by this point. By 1910, plans for a subway were well underway. The city was able to lease their portion of the canal for use as an underground subway that would then be topped with a road. In 1916, voters approved a $6 million bond to fund a 16-mile loop connecting downtown to neighborhoods like Norwood, Oakley, and Hyde Park. It was to be partially underground and partially above ground, with some parts being elevated as well. Now, unfortunately, the United States entered World War I, and all construction was put on hold. By the time the war was over, costs had risen so much due to inflation. The city began construction in 1920, but by 1927, they had run out of money. Political infighting began, and then we saw the onset of the Great Depression in 1929, but citizens remained hopeful that the project would be completed as the economy improved. This, unfortunately, never happened. The project was initially restored, but then put on hold again after World War II began. And after that war, we saw the increase in car usage, and the auto industry lobbied the city hard to use the subway's right-of-way to build highways. And they got what they wanted. Only 2.2 miles of tunnel were ever built, as well as 7 stations. The tunnel, as well as 4 underground stations, remain intact, but the 3 above ground were demolished when I-75 was built. This was really part of a larger push in the United States to defund or abandon rail projects, and as a result, the United States has become very dependent on cars. Now today, you can actually still see the entrance to the tunnels right off I-75. And then the abandoned tunnel tracks underneath Central Parkway into downtown. So right now I am standing on Central Parkway, which means the original subway tunnels lie directly below my feet. They actually put a full water main in here back in the 50s in order to save on construction, and there's some fiber optic cables down there as well. You actually used to be able to get down there a lot easier, and they used to offer tours, but not so much anymore. There are unfortunately no plans to revive the subway here in Cincinnati, but many have talked about it and tried. They did build a streetcar system here back in the 2010s, but after living here, I really dream about what it would be like to have a full-on rapid transit system. Another subway constructed in a different canal is the Rochester Subway in Rochester, New York. However, this one actually operated. In the early 1900s, the Erie Canal was being rerouted south of Rochester, leaving a portion in downtown abandoned, so the city purchased it to use as a subway. Construction began in 1922, and the system officially opened in 1927. The system was about 7 miles, with just 2 of those miles being underground right in downtown Rochester. And fun fact, Rochester happens to be the smallest city in North America to have ever built a subway, and it is also the only city in the entire world to have built an entire subway and then abandoned it. Now, one of my absolute favorite features of this system was the use of this old aqueduct, which is now called the Broad Street Bridge. It was built in the 1830s, and it originally carried part of the Erie Canal. Unfortunately, the Great Depression began soon after this system opened, and ridership quickly decreased, turning public perception against the subway. But during World War II, ridership increased again, again, and it seemed like the system was maybe going to even be expanded, but after the war ended, it started to lose money again, and the city council voted to end service in 1956. Once again, this was part of a bigger thing happening throughout the United States. People were moving towards cars, highways, and suburbs. Following the subway's closure, the city of Rochester used part of the subway bed to build Interstate 490 and 590. Now, freight trains were able to make use of the abandoned rail up until the 90s, but after that, the old subway facilities sat abandoned. Back in 2014, a local photographer named Mark Goho uploaded 360 panoramas to Google Maps inside the old subway tunnel. You can check it out for yourself on Google Maps. I'll have the link below. Throughout the last decade and a half, Rochester has worked to improve its downtown, and it has built several projects that have involved filling in parts of the original subway tunnel, but some of it still remains below the feet of Rochester residents, unseen by the general public for decades. While not technically an entire system, Los Angeles also has an entire abandoned subway tunnel. The Belmont Tunnel, or Hollywood Subway as it's more commonly known, was a part of the Pacific Electric Railway, and streetcars used this mile-long tunnel to cut through heavily congested parts of the city from 1925 until 1955, when Pacific Electric was sold off to a company that replaced the streetcars with buses. The tunnel was promptly abandoned, and throughout the second half of the 90s, several buildings were built with their foundations through the tunnel. However, some of the tunnel still remains to this day. At the end of this tunnel was the Subway Terminal building, which in 2007 was renovated into luxury apartment building. Also in California is the Eureka Valley Station in San Francisco. It's an abandoned streetcar station that was built in the Twin Peaks Tunnel and opened with the tunnel in 1918. When they were working on the Market Street Subway in the 70s, they decided to close this station, and it officially closed in 1972. They ended up demolishing the buildings at the street level for this station, but you can still see the station from passing Muni trains, but only for just a second because the station is heavily walled off. Now, back on the other side of the country is probably the most iconic subway in all of the United States, the New York City Subway. Despite its current ridership of over 2 billion people a year, it has seen its fair share of abandoned stations, and some of them are quite famous for other reasons as well. Now, unlike our previous abandoned subways, a big reason that stations were abandoned in New York City was due to the stations being too close together. As capacity increased and subway trains got longer, they would start lengthening the platforms, eventually making some stations too close together. Most of this work and these stations were closed in the 50s and 60s. Now, probably the most famous of the abandoned stations, and my personal favorite, is City Hall Station. It opened in 1904 as one of the original 28 stations of the New York subway. The station is absolutely gorgeous, from its architecture to the tile work to the skylights. It would have been such a sight to see back in the 1900s. It's situated on a looping section of track, making it a curved station, so as ridership grew, it was unable to accommodate the longer trains. And it was close enough to the Brooklyn Bridge station, so it was closed in December of 1945. You can actually see this station today. It's something I have always wanted to do, but it's technically not allowed, so your mileage may vary, but if you stay on the number 6 train past the last stop, it actually uses this loop to turn around, so you can see the old station. There's also a museum that offers tours of this station 3 times a year, which is another bucket list item of mine. And speaking of that museum, it is the New York Transit Museum, and it is actually built inside a different abandoned subway station. The original Court Street station opened in 1936, but by 1946 it had closed to the public. It was used as a set for various movies throughout the 60s and 70s, and in 1976 the city decided to open a transit exhibit in the station as part of the US bicentennial celebration. It was meant to just be a temporary exhibit, but it was so popular, it eventually turned into a permanent museum. They have a bunch of really cool exhibits, as well as old trains, trolleys, and buses. It's definitely worth checking out if you are interested in transit. It's like stepping back in time. Now, there is another abandoned metro station that has been turned into a museum, and it is in Madrid. This was one of the 8 original stops on the Madrid Metro, but like New York, its platforms could not accommodate longer trains, and there were other nearby stations, so as passenger numbers grew, Madrid eventually made the decision to close this station in 1966. It sat abandoned as a ghost station for 40 years until rehabilitation efforts began in 2006 to turn it into a museum. The museum, Platform Zero, opened in 2008, and they've basically restored the station back to to its original glory. And the best part is, trains still go right through the station. Another ghost station where trains still go through is in Barcelona. Barcelona actually has a few ghost stations, but one serves as the office for retired metro employees. Plans changed during construction, and it ended up being too close to other stations, so it actually never opened to the public, but Line 5 still passes right through the station. But like I said, Barcelona does have several abandoned stations, including one that was built in 1911 as part of the very first metro line, but it was never used. And then there are several others that were abandoned as the system grew and were no longer needed. Now, there are a few other cities in Europe that are not unfamiliar with ghost stations, and at the start of the Second War, the French government cut back on Paris metro service significantly, closing about a quarter of their metro stations. A majority of these stations eventually opened back up or were merged into future expansions, but there were 4 stations that never reopened, and they still remain abandoned to this day. In addition, Paris has 4 stations that were built but never opened. Another city that has several abandoned ghost stations is London. As the oldest metro system in the world, it does make sense that they would have had to abandon some of the stations as the system grew. Most of the street entrances to these abandoned stations have been demolished or converted, but the London Transport Museum offers tours of some of the abandoned underground stations, and some of them also were used as shelter during World War II. Lastly, in Europe, the Oslo metro in Norway has several abandoned stations, a majority of which are above ground. However, they do have 2 underground stations that sit abandoned, both because they could no longer accommodate longer cars and they were unable to be upgraded. Some of the only ghost stations in the Southern Hemisphere are in Buenos Aires. The underground there opened all the way back in 1913, and by the 60s, they were working on expansion. And as we've learned throughout this video, expansion usually means losing some stations. All 4 of the ghost stations here were closed because they were either too close to another station or the line had been rerouted away from that station. It's no secret that building a subway is a massive financial commitment for a city. But when systems are built and then abandoned, it's not just a physical scar on a city, but a financial one too. When a station or an entire system is abandoned, the money that was spent building it is a total loss. Cincinnati spent around $13 million on their subway in the 1920s, which is equivalent to around $240 million today. And it never made a single cent back because it never carried a single paying passenger. When a subway system gets built and actually opens, it's at least able to boost the local economy through easier transportation, higher property values, and better job access. It also creates jobs itself and creates more connected cities. Now, the most unfortunate part about abandoned infrastructure is it's not free. Cities usually have to spend money to maintain these properties in some way, especially if they lie directly below extremely busy streets like here in Cincinnati. There's also the issue of securing these places to avoid accidents or trespassing. We've been talking about lines and stations that were actually built, where money was spent to create something that was either abandoned or never used, but there are even more systems that were never built because the project was abandoned before work ever began for one reason or another. When you start to look at these failures, especially here in the US, you kind of start to feel like, what is the point? But cities that have finished their systems and have flourishing metros like New York, Paris, London, and Madrid, these places are better connected than any city built only for cars. Subways connect neighborhoods, cut down on travel times, and open up opportunities for citizens that simply did not exist before. So what can we learn from these stories? Well, first of all, don't start building directly before the Great Depression, and also don't build your stations too close together, obviously. But really, the lesson is to build systems that are flexible and can grow with cities as they grow. A big mistake that Rochester made with their system was not incentivizing development near their subway stations. In order for a rapid transit system to work, it has to be close to where people live and work. Otherwise, they will choose other options. The biggest hurdle I see these days is convincing people that transit is worth the investment. Transit projects have always been a gamble, but without them, we wouldn't have the connected, vibrant cities we know today. Every tunnel dug and every station built is a reminder that building the future means taking risks. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!